morning, everyone. Future podcasters, present day podcasters, would-be podcasters. It's a pleasure to see you. Feel free to turn your cameras on and let me know how you're feeling as we go along. And of course, we have the chat room. So without further ado, I will move to my first slide. And here we go. I am Ron Elving. I have been working for NPR, mostly in a full-time capacity until recent years, back to the 1990s. And they still call me a senior Washington correspondent or something like that. I can't really argue with the senior part anymore. And I also teach at American University in the School of Public Affairs, where I'm an executive in residence and a professorial lecturer. That last title was one that my wife gave me actually a number of years ago. So it's nice to have it officially recognized by the university. We're going to talk about podcasting, and I'm going to talk about this with the assumption that everyone is interested in some sense or another, becoming a podcaster. I think everyone has the opportunity in our world to do that. And so I'm going to go ahead, unless anyone has some sort of a question to begin with, I'll just proceed. Let me just ask you how many of you have a podcast now, and I can expand my little view here of all of you and get a sense of how many people might be responding to that. How many of you have a podcast now or have been part of a podcast? I assume all of you listen to podcasts, and I assume that there's a certain amount of interest on your part in starting one as well. You know, it's not really a new idea anymore. It was a very fresh idea a while ago and really transformative in the audio world. There are now perhaps, and I'm not kidding about this, 750,000 podcasts worldwide on the entire internet. So in that sense, perhaps some of the bloom may be off the rose for this particular technology and medium, but listeners continue to seek new podcasts to add to their feed. And I would emphasize this, I think, above all else. Podcasting should be fun, and is as much fun as ever. People have a very good time doing this. It can get to be a burden if you have a very regular schedule of producing podcasts, such as once a week, twice a week. I can tell you 5 times a week is a burden, but if you have the people to do it and you have the energy to do it, and if you have the support to do it, that can be the best way to really build an audience by doing it on a regular basis, and even on a 5 times a week basis, although again, you're going to need a lot of support to do that. It's actually become so common to have a podcast that the New Yorker has already officially recognized this by having this cartoon in which one character says to the other, "I'm thinking of stopping a podcast." I like to think of podcasting as part of the long arc of audio history. It was not so much a revolution as an evolution. Now, just to go really quickly over this arc of audio that I'm talking about, perhaps some of you have seen the remarkably good documentary that ran on PBS a few years ago about the origins of radio, the inventors of the technology, the first users of the technology, the people who made radio the medium of entertainment and information sharing in the United States in the 30s and 40s, and really set the stage, if you will, did the groundwork for what became television. And radio, of course, endured. It seems that any medium that we have for a period of time, all the way back to parchment, even when it's superseded by more efficient and easier technologies, it never entirely goes away. We still have parchment. We still have all kinds of printed matter. We still have people who do calligraphy. So every new thing is new for a while and then superseded by something else that's new, but it doesn't necessarily have to disappear. So radio stuck around even after television came along. A great thing about it was that it brought you the whole world in an instantaneous sort of way. You could be live at Gandhi's funeral, for example, with Edward R. Murrow narrating and telling you about it. At the same time, radio could serve very small audiences efficiently, either through a low power station or because someone was willing to support it and do the necessary fundraising to make it possible for relatively specific audiences, people who spoke a particular language, people who had a particular religion, to be able to have a radio station of their own. And that was true on a local basis pretty much all over the world. But AM radio was also not so good. And maybe not that many of you remember any AM radio, but the sound was bad. The towers were ugly. They still are. Commercials were everywhere. There were extraordinarily high barriers to entering the field on a national scale. If you wanted to be heard beyond your local transmitter, there were enormous barriers to that entry, some of which were set up by the federal government back in the 1920s when they first began to regulate broadcast. But, you know, radio was the place to be for several decades, and then TV came and radio was not cool. Kids saved radio. The young people of America discovered radio. Radio was independence for them. It was rebellion. People of my generation can tell you when they got their first transistor radio, especially when they got a little something to put in their ear so their parents couldn't hear what they were listening to, and they could play it as loud as they wanted at any hour of the day or night that they wanted after their parents had gone to bed. So there was rock and roll radio, the generation that I'm describing here in Elvis and the Beatles and the protest songs and the folk revolution. And there is a wonderful line in a Van Morrison song that actually has been misinterpreted, but many of us thought he was saying, "I'm gunning down the old man with a transistor radio." So it was a form of patricide, if you will, or at least parenticide. We were getting away from our parents. Now, it turns out that actually Van Morrison was talking about a river that was called the Old Man in Ireland. And to go down it in a makeshift funky boat was called gunning. So he was actually talking about going on a little river excursion with this transistor radio. But for a generation of us, we thought he was talking about a figurative, surely figurative sense of patricide and a certain sense of independence. But AM stations were still, in their own way, the man. They were the commercial world. There were high barriers, as I said, to entry on a national basis, and their economics were far from being entirely cool. Then the revolution turns to FM. Another kind of radio, and not everyone had it, but it was much higher quality, much better sound. And the stations were, you probably had to be a little closer to the transmitter, but you could get there. And certainly anyone in a metropolitan area could. So pretty soon you had this concept of alternative radio. And FM radios could be right there with you in your car. And the car also was a symbol of independence. So FM went very quickly from being a niche medium to being normative. It was very important to the baby boomer generation and the generations that have come from or since the baby boom generation. It was inherently alternative because it was mostly about music, but with some news for news and cultural communication. It was mostly about music, and partly because the sound was so much better, and partly because that was what really drove audience. But in the creation of the notion of an alternative way to get information or music or entertainment, there was also the rediscovery of audio as an imagination cue. Now, in the golden age of radio, we had lots of dramas, you know, The Lone Ranger, all kinds of later television shows began as radio programs. We also had variety shows where comedians would talk and have guests, and they were highly scripted, and they mostly came from New York, but you got the idea that you could tell a story on the radio and even dramatize that story. Now, along about the same time, we're talking about the 1960s, Congress created the public broadcasting system in 1967, and in the last minute addition on the floor, an amendment was passed that added 2 words, and radio. But nobody had any idea what that was going to consist of. There was educational radio. Many universities and school systems had radio transmitters of a minor nature with not very much reach. And nobody really had much idea what was going to be done, piggybacking on PBS, with regard to radio. But they sort of thought it would be a good idea to also include some kind of public radio. And that's how it was born. It didn't really get up and running until 1971. But there was a very interesting man who's actually still with us, who was the author of the first NPR mission statement way back in the early 1970s. His name is Bill Simmering. And he said this: radio is the most personal medium that we have because the human voice is so expressive. It's a storytelling medium, and we all need storytelling. Now, conspicuously absent here was any reference to music. And while many public radio stations in the early days, educational stations, played classical music and were thought of as being sort of a long hair in the old sense, egghead in the eternal sense, Bill was talking about using it as a storytelling medium. And we all need storytelling. And I love that formulation of language. So NPR gets started in the early 1970s. The first program that was distributed nationally was All Things Considered. What really broke through was the gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Watergate hearings in 1973. That segued into gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Judiciary Committee impeachment hearings in 1974. And suddenly people were talking about what they'd heard on the radio. Now, this is way before C-SPAN. This is way before C-SPAN radio. And it was a breakthrough that people could carry this radio with them or be in their car, and maybe they were even at work, but they could stay with the hearings that ran all through the summer of 1973 and were key to Richard Nixon's eventual impeachment process leading to his resignation. So this was an upheaval of major proportions in the country in the early 1970s. And there were only 3 television stations, and people couldn't always have a television with them. They used to be rather bulky. So radio really found a place in the lives of people who cared a lot about public affairs and who were just following the dramatic story of what was going to happen to the president. So then along came Morning Edition, which was the morning show that eventually would become a larger audience. And after 2000, the Florida 2000 election and the closing up of the news operations in many, many, many local radio stations around the country, particularly those bought by Clear Channel, there was a need, if you will, for some place to go on the dial to find the news. And in the big metropolitan areas, there was an all news commercial AM station, AM FM station, where you could go for the news, but it was very highly commercialized, a lot of shouting, a lot of ads, many, many, many ads. So people hunted around on the dial until they found NPR, and the audience tripled after the year 2000 from roughly 10 million people, not negligible, but minor in terms of broadcast television, to 30 million. And that counts all public radio programming from all the local stations as well as NPR proper. So that was a rather major change in the role of audio in the media mix. The next revolution, of course, was the internet. And any kind of internet-based media, including audio, super low cost, almost absurdly low cost compared to doing broadcast. It was cutting edge. It was internet audio, not radio. And that, of course, led directly into podcasting in 2005, because podcasting was essentially a way of making a compact program, not an hour-long program or a 2-hour-long program or a magazine show with one person after another talking, but rather just a compact presentation, 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes, but with produced audio and, in some cases, fairly high quality. Now, one of the very first ones we did at NPR was about politics. It was called It's All Politics. And we did 350 weekly episodes from 2006 to 2013. Ken Rudin, political editor at the time, and myself would essentially talk about the news of the week in politics. We would have guests, we would play some audio. It was 18, 20 minutes. And sometimes we'd play a little music and have a little bit of fun. But there was lots of history, lots of background on various election issues and various election individuals, lots of inside baseball, and it was geared, highly geared really, to political junkies. And Ken went out on his own in 2013 with a podcast rather, that is called Political Junkie. He is still doing it. It is heard on some NPR stations and is also an internet podcast. Now, and since 2013, we have a successor, and that is the NPR Politics podcast, which has gone to the point of being daily and even more than daily. It is oftentimes done twice in a day if there's a major news development, or if there's a debate, or if there's an appearance of an unusual nature, say the State of the Union address by the president or something else. This podcast goes on, and there's a rotating cast with a rotating group of hosts. And many times, obviously, this goes out fairly late at night, so people pick up on it first thing in the morning. And it has a very explicit appeal to younger listeners, people who might not have ever listened to NPR radio. And that has been its area of success, reaching people who have never been NPR listeners before, and to some degree, people who go back to the podcasts to pick up on things that they might have missed on the radio, such as the regular programs. Everything is podcast, by the way, and we're going to look at a couple of the other NPR podcasts besides politics, but this is really where it began. And then we also do live shows. Now, we haven't been doing any since February, but we did one in LA just the week before everything shut down. And we did a big one in Chicago in January, and we do them fairly regularly here in Washington, always as fundraisers for the local NPR affiliate radio station. They're not done to enrich the NPR individuals. NPR people regard themselves largely as public servants and don't make any separate money by doing these podcasts. And some of our really outstanding podcasters have gone out on their own. As I mentioned, Ken Rudin, Shankar Vedantam, with his particular podcast, which started as a feature on one of the radio programs and went out as a podcast. And some of our folks with high name recognition can make a go of that. So it does have that potential as well. But we have lots and lots and lots of podcasts now. Planet Money was also one of the very first ones, talking in understandable terms, accessible terms about big questions of economics. Really got its start with the 2008 crisis in the credit markets, and also that spread, of course, to the stock market and led to the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. That's what gave them their start. And you'll notice that broadcasting, and public broadcasting in particular, seems to thrive in times of national crisis and emergency. Code Switch, which has become a major contributor, I think, to the dialogue towards racial understanding in the United States. It certainly has made a big difference to life within and around NPR. Fresh Air, which is, of course, Terry Gross's broadcast from WHYY in Philadelphia. She is an absolutely unique interviewer. She has very strict rules for how she does her interviews. She almost never does the interviews face-to-face, so that she can concentrate on the sound that is being made and not assume that the listener is able to see the face of the person she's talking to. So she gears her questions and gears the structure of the interviews, particularly to listeners. And that translates, of course, to podcast perfectly. Hidden Brain, I also mentioned Shankar's Hidden Brain a moment or two ago. Invisibilia, which ran several seasons, won a lot of awards for the discussions of how the human brain works and how our brain and mind function together and what a difference that makes in our life. Tiny Desk Concerts, wow. Now we're kind of verging into entertainment a little bit, but it's pretty great entertainment, and it does have, in its own way, an extraordinary educational value by bringing to light a lot of musicians that otherwise might not be well known. And in many cases, of course, very well known. Taylor Swift dropped by earlier this year before everything shut down and did 3 songs, which is the standard format. It was bizarre, obviously, to see a megastar like Taylor Swift basically singing 3 songs at a little upright piano at Bob Boylan's desk at NPR, not far from the Washington desk. But that's how the Tiny Desk concert format works. Nobody makes any money. The musicians play for free. Of course, they get some promotion out of it. And for the ones who are obscure, it can be really, really important exposure. But that's a podcast now. You can also, just dial it up online. If you've never watched an NPR Tiny Desk concert, you might be astonished at the range of musicians from Yo-Yo Ma to the New Orleans Preservation Hall Jazz Band. Just, it's extraordinary. And the way they get people jammed into this little tiny space is entertaining in and of itself. Many of you are probably familiar with Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the weekly humorous quiz show where the point is laughs as much as it is questions, but you can learn from from Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. You can learn about what's been in the news if there's anything that might have escaped you in the course of a week. And of course, it's highly entertaining because all of the panelists are humorists. It's Been a Minute is Sam Sanders' podcast. If you've never listened to it, I urge you to check it out. Very easy to find. All you have to do is go to your podcast app. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about what podcast apping means. And Embedded, that's one that has featured, among other things, some of the best investigative journalism that has otherwise been done for broadcast. And again, I urge you to discover it. It's something other than what we can do on radio. And it is a good example of the special value and abilities, if you will, of a podcast. How I Built This and Wow in the World, Guy Raz's creations, definitely highly produced and highly successful, more or less built around the model of TED Talks, which Guy's also been involved in, and a number of others. As you see, we have really generated a lot of attention to podcasting at NPR in recent years. And the thing is, with the shutdowns and the quarantines and the reliance that we have on some other way of staying in touch and keeping life interesting besides getting out into the world, this has really been a boon to have these kinds of podcasts. And I find it enormously useful. I think a lot of people of varying age groups do. And as I've said before, it brings an all new generation of audience to public broadcasting. And because audio lends itself to so many different presentational formats and means of delivery, it's flexible, it's personal, and I think it's going to stick around. And this is all still from Bill Simmering, not at the time that he first wrote the mission statement in '73, but 30 years later, when looking back at why public radio was, and of course you could say exactly the same thing of podcasting, surviving and going forward. So let's talk about your place in this arc of audio. How do you fit into the long sweep of all this? I said earlier, we got a lot of podcasts. Apple's podcast platform had about 550,000 active shows even 2 years ago. We now believe the number is well over 750. And that's a lot of audio volume for your ears and your time. But if you're considering starting a podcast, here are some thoughts. I'm going to ask you to, ask yourself some deep and difficult questions about what you want to do. But I am not trying to discourage anyone from starting a podcast. It is entirely possible that the most popular podcast of 2021 does not exist today. One of the great things about podcasting is how fast you can mount a podcast, how fast you can react to events and produce something that people are going to want to hear. So let's ask those big questions first. The more specific you can be in giving these answers to yourself, the better in terms of bringing this off. First of all, you want to ask yourself, do I care if I'm making money? Do I care if I do this to produce a living? Do I need this money for my own personal needs and take care of my family? That creates, of course, a whole new set of demands and expectations. And probably you're going to need some kind of financial angel to get you up and running if this is your only source of income. Many people want to do it just to reach a new audience. They may already be involved in teaching. They may already be educators. They may already be in government service. But they feel like there are other people out there they can share what they know with, share their perspective with. And this is a way to reach those folks, one that they might not have ever imagined doing before. Sometimes people already have a brand. They might be some sort of public speaker, or they might represent a particular church or other religious organization. This is a way to promote the name of that organization, promote the brand. It contributes also, I think, to the overall discourse, and generally speaking, I think it has been a more civil contribution to the discourse than you will find in many other parts of the media, more so than, say, talk radio, more so than much of what you see on cable television news. It contributes to a more civil discourse, in part because the people who do this kind of work need to be thoughtful about it in order to be successful. So some people want to do this just to promote themselves as a thought leader, maybe not necessarily even with as egocentric a notion as I just described. They just have thoughts they would like to have added to the mix. They would like to find if there are other people who respond to their thoughts. And this is a way of doing it. And finally, there are people with real knowledge, how-to knowledge, understanding or comprehending knowledge, or a message that they would just like to share. And whether they make any money doing it or not, whether it costs them money ultimately, but that's fine. They want to do it anyway. And I think that's an important part of what sets podcasting apart, is that there are so many reasons that people do it other than money. Whereas so much of the rest of the media, the costs of entry are so high that people doing it for money are driven by the decisions that that forces upon you, the imperatives that it forces upon you. So what is your idea for a podcast? Let's assume you're not going to just buy a mic and get some support and start in. You have an idea. You have something you want to do. You want to talk about making furniture. You want to talk about building a canoe entirely out of birch bark. You want to talk about your feelings about being quarantined for 6 months by yourself or perhaps with others. You have an idea, something that you think could sustain more than a few episodes of a particular podcast. So what is it? And when you say what it is, then ask yourself the question again, what is it really? Is that sort of high-minded thing that I just thought I said to myself about what my podcast was about? Is that really why I want to do this? Or is there something else that I'm trying to get at here and I'm not being entirely forthcoming with myself? Is what I want to do well suited to the format of a podcast? Is it the best way to do it? Or is what I really want to do more like writing pamphlets or handbills or letters to the New York Times? I have a friend who writes letters to the New York Times a good portion of the time, every day. And a remarkable number of them actually do appear in the New York Times. That's his way of speaking to the world, if you will. And I think he's quite satisfied with it. But there are other people who aren't going to find satisfaction in that, no matter how much energy and time they're willing to put into it. And of course, there's no money in that either. For them, podcasting might be a potential avenue. What do you want to accomplish? Is it all strictly expression? Or is there, and there's nothing wrong with that, or is there some other larger purpose? Are you trying to persuade people to follow a particular teaching? Perhaps you want to advance the thinking of a particular religious leader or psychological or spiritual line of thought and reasoning. That works very well in a podcast. Perhaps you have a political goal. Perhaps you would like to have a podcast strictly about, things you see wrong in the electoral system, like say the Electoral College or some of the other constitutional mechanisms that exist that govern our elections. That's a very popular topic right now because of the obvious reason. And what are you trying to accomplish is a question to really ask yourself before you devote the time and effort this is going to entail. And a good idea is to say, and I don't mean to say you've got to stop if you can't come up with a great answer for this one right away, but it's an important question. What makes my podcast, our podcast, the podcast you're contemplating, distinctive? I won't say unique. It's probably too high a bar, but just say distinctive. Does it have a flavor? You might want to consider some of the other podcasts that are already out there in the general subject area. Listen to as many as you can and say, well, yeah, those people are doing a pretty good job, but But I have something I think stands a little bit apart. I think I have enough of a brand, a personal brand that I can put upon this that it would be distinctive. And then, of course, you're going to need some passion. I can't really quantify the amount of passion you're going to need, but you're going to want to be driven, because sometimes it's going to be a heavy lift. And if you're doing this with other people, you look at each other and you say, why are we the right people to be doing this podcast right now? Okay, and let's get practical. Do you have the time? And do you have the resources? Because it's going to take some of both. And the less time you have, the more resources you're going to need. And the fewer resources you have, the more time it's going to take you. Also, let's ask the question, who's the audience? Who would want or need this podcast? And are we trying to reach an existing audience, or are we trying to create a new one? I don't have any prejudice towards either one. You can certainly reach an existing audience and then add entirely new people. That's fine too. But if you're trying to reach an existing audience, you're going to want to pay much closer attention to what people are doing now that are reaching that audience, and ask yourself, how am I going to be better than them? How am I going to do it at least as well and compete for their, obviously in some sense or another, finite amount of listening time? Or am I trying to really kind of create a new audience entirely? You remember, Steve Jobs would always say, I'm going to create the thing that people don't know they want yet. I'm going to create the thing that people have never heard of and never thought of, but are going to want when it exists. And to some degree, that's a good formula for creating a new podcast. I know nobody's listening to a podcast right now about X, but I think a year from now, it's going to be very popular, and we're going to create an entirely new audience for it. Are you going to bring a unique value or perspective to the listeners' lives? Where are our listeners when they listen? And that may be sort of a strange question. What difference does it make? But it does make a difference. Are they walking? Are they exercising? Are they at work, acting as though they're working? Are they just having a good time listening to your podcast because they don't really need to do anything else? Are they taking care of children? Are they responsible for anything else, say like a bus load of passengers? What are people doing while they're listening to your podcast? And what difference does that make to the degree of complexity or the degree of brevity that you bring to what you're going to put together? And in every podcast you do, you should have some sense of what people are going to take away. What will they talk about afterwards? Somebody said, you just spend another 20 minutes with those earphones on? What were you listening to? What would you say? What do you want them to say? What do you want them to be full of after they've listened to your podcast? And do you envision this being something that people would enjoy very much all by themselves, or something that they would be really eager to share with others? Is it headphone stuff, earphone stuff, maybe even secret listener stuff? Or is it, let's have the whole world be part of this. Let's have the whole world be tuned into this. Those are different kinds of challenges in terms of how you put your material together. Are you thinking of doing this all by yourself? Maybe just 2 or 3 people? Are you prepared to do a monologue? Or would it be better if you always had 2 hosts? Notwithstanding what I'm doing right now, I would, generally speaking, recommend that you have at least 2 hosts, at least 2 voices. Generally speaking, the better, the more the better. And certainly different personalities lend more energy. So you actually get a conversation going within the podcast itself. And do you want to have guests? Do you want to have regulars? Do you want to have it be totally spontaneous, or are you going to script it? If you're going to script it, that entails a great deal of work. On the other hand, with a script, you will waste a lot less time, and you will have much more consistency of quality of material, rather than just relying on somebody, perhaps yourself, having something interesting to say over and over in a regular broadcast or regular podcast schedule. And if you are going to do scripting, how much editing is it going to need? Is it going to be notional scripting? We're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. There's your script. Go with that. Or are you really going to script it the way some podcasts are extraordinarily carefully podcast scripted? there are people, I'm thinking of Preet Bharara, for example, who do complicated subjects such as constitutional law on a podcast with guests with what I would call minimal scripting. People that I've known who've been on that podcast say he basically asks questions from a script and lets you answer without expecting the guest to be scripted. By and large, guests are not scripted. That's certainly true on NPR. But just about everything that comes from the producer, that is, whether it's a podcaster or a radio producer or television producer, that stuff is very carefully scripted. Everything you're hearing Jake Tapper say as it scrolls by on the television screen, he is looking into a camera that is showing him the script. He's looking into a camera, a black rectangle. Behind the letters, behind the words, is the camera. So by looking at his script, he's looking in your eyes. And not entirely dissimilar to what I'm doing right now, except that I don't really have a teleprompter type screen. So editing the script is an enormous part of the process, and that could entail a whole nother person or more than one. And then let's get back to that idea about telling a story. It helps to conceive of whatever you're going to talk about in terms of a story with storytelling elements. And this is old stuff. Okay, I mean, this goes back to the ancient Greeks talking about a story being defined by structure, beginning, middle, and end, with characters. And they can be fanciful characters, they can be figments of your imagination, but there have to be recognizable characters. If you're doing one about sports, you have major sports figures that everyone recognizes. You're supplied with characters by talking about what goes on in sports. Conflict. Here again, sports gives you obvious conflict. You have the Braves and the Dodgers, and they're in the National League Championship Series, and that gives you the automatic conflict that you need. Politics is the same. Other aspects of life, conflict might be a little less obvious. And you need, for good storytelling, a form of resolution. It doesn't have to be a final resolution to the conflict, but each game within a sporting series or each election needs to have an end point. And your storytelling needs to have an end point, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Seems obvious, but actually is a little more elusive than might appear. Now let's talk even more practically. What are you going to call it? What are you going to call your podcast? You want something that makes sense. You want something that people can figure out, but you also want something that is catchy. Just take it. Catchy, memorable. I like clever or sly. I think that's a good idea. It gets old after a while if you just relying on a pun, I suppose. But to catch people's attention in the first place and kind of give them an idea of what you're doing and what your attitude might be. Clever and sly keywords, catchy, memorable words work well. Now, the New York Times famous podcast about current events, government, and politics is just called The Daily. I would argue that that's just a little too simple, just maybe a little too meta simple. Just calling it The Daily doesn't really tell you what it's about. If you're the New York Times, I suppose you get away with that in the same way they get away with that little symbol you see here. It's a T, and that's all that you know. It's just a T. And so you're supposed to understand that if you see the letter T, that means the Times. And if you say the Times, you mean the New York Times. Okay, maybe they get away with that. That's fine. But let's face it, most people need to have something that's a little more of a grabber. All of our NPR podcasts use the little NPR logo to sort of get you there. This visual idea on Invisibilia, to me, is successful because it gives you a little bit of an idea of what the podcast is about. This sort of integrated mind and brain and behavior storytelling that Invisibilia was famous for. You might recognize just the facial recognition factor for this third podcast down here. It's the Morning Update, and it's based on the Rush Limbaugh show, the radio show, phenomenon of radio history, extraordinarily popular, extraordinarily consistent audience going back decades, really to the early 90s at least. Rush Limbaugh has had an extraordinarily loyal audience. And in podcasting, the size of the audience may not really matter that much, but the loyalty of the audience does. So if you can continue bringing people back, a cadre of listeners, that's really important. Now, if you're as famous as Rush Limbaugh, all you need is your face and some other little moniker that indicates that this is not the full show, but an update since the show was recorded. And here's some others. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of clever names. And note that all of these also have a strong visual element to put across what they're about. Now, in some of these were not ongoing podcasts. For example, Fiasco is about the 2000 Florida presidential election and all the travails and sorrows thereof. And some of these others are more ongoing. But some of these podcasts have become famous, particularly for the impact that they were able to make in a short period of time. And a lot of that, I think, in terms of selling these podcasts, initially at least, had to do with the visual impact that people saw when they went to various applications that were showing them podcasts they might be interested in listening to. So if you can afford to get some professional art, that helps. I think I mentioned earlier the decision about how many people you want to have involved. Some of that is driven by money. Some of it is driven by your intent. And some of it is driven by expertise. Can you do all of the technical stuff yourself, or do you need to hire somebody who does that for a living? Can you afford, if you're doing it on your own, the equipment, or are you going to rent equipment or have some sort of relationship with an institution that has equipment? I mean, I've talked a lot about NPR's podcasts. Obviously, we had the huge leg up advantage of already having professional quality studios with professional quality studio technicians who were not necessarily producing a radio program every minute of the day. So when they weren't in their downtime, we took them over to do podcasts. The equipment was all there and the people were all there. Very few podcasters have that as a starting point. Most people have to start kind of from scratch. There was an effort made for a while in Washington, D.C. to turn this one former restaurant into a kind of podcast haven. They changed the name to Chatter, and people produced podcasts from inside the restaurant with a little bit of restaurant sound in the background. And one group after another came in with a producer and talent, as in the radio and television industry, they refer to the people on air. And they brought in guests and they set aside an area for it, and it, went forward. Now, it doesn't really make any money necessarily. It doesn't necessarily bring people into the restaurant or any, attached thing like a bar, but it at least can provide a venue, and you can all share the investment in that equipment. You pay some small fee to use the equipment that is being laid out for you by that small but nonetheless steady institution. I shouldn't say too steady, because after a period of time of doing this, the restaurant, for its own reasons, went under, so that's no longer available. But there are places you can go, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and give you some guides to how to find them. The equipment is not necessarily hugely expensive. You're not doing video. You're in a much more manageable world. It's an audio medium. I just mentioned the visual element. The cover art that I was showing you a few moments ago can matter a good bit. And note how all of those little squares were made for an iPhone type screen. Then you can do this by creating files that then can be distributed in a variety of ways. They can be in different formats. You're probably already familiar with JPG and PNG formats for photographs and other things. You're probably going to need some standards in terms of your equipment, in terms of pixels. And where are you going to, and that, by the way, is with respect to the visual art that I was talking about. You need to produce that visual art within this range of pixels. Otherwise, it's not going to translate well to iPhone formats. So where are you going to make it? Where are you going to do the podcast? If you have access to a studio, as I was saying before, that's delightful, but most of us don't. Home studio, if you have a little home studio, and it doesn't have to be terribly complicated, or are you going to do it outdoors or do it in some sense or another on the hoof, on the run, outdoors, and maybe in some other venue, a field production. Again, the home studio, don't be daunted. It can be done with a relatively modest investment. So then do we hire the professionals to record and edit the recording, or can we do it ourselves? There are lots of training videos that you can watch. Do you want to use music? If you want to use music, you have to be aware of the copyright laws that will require further attention as you go forward using somebody else's music. That's something that people can get in trouble for, especially if you're using, you're actually making money on your podcast. As long as it's not making any money, it's entirely possible that lawyers would leave you alone. But if you're making extensive use of music, anything more than a few notes, a few measures of music, you do need to be conscious of this. And what about hardware and software? You are going to need some stuff. Microphones, headphones, a mixer, and a recording and editing application for your computer. Now, if you're interested in doing this, there are some places to get started, and there are people who are out there to help you without necessarily selling you something, and those folks are invaluable. Some of you are probably familiar with Wirecutter, which is a quality service which assesses all kinds of technical equipment, microphones, headphones, stereo equipment, and so on. But you're going to need as many microphones as you're going to have voices. You're going to need quality headphones, and you're going to need a mixer. That means something that adjusts the volume from each source, including both microphones live and also online feeds from other sources of sound. And you're going to need some editing equipment. Now, in a really crude podcast, you can just throw it together and throw it out there to the internet world and see to what degree people can endure your rather rough-hewn product. You're probably going to find more satisfaction in something that takes it up a notch or two. But you can buy high-quality microphones for a few $100s, high-quality headphones for a lot less than that, a mixer. It's going to cost you into the hundreds, and the recording and editing applications get cheaper all the time. So none of that needs to be an absolute bar if you're really interested in doing this. I don't think you can do it just with a few bucks and a lot to say. You're going to need something that makes it sound good. Now, how do you actually get it cast? How do you get that pod out there? There are pod hosting services, and they will host it for you, distribute, and monetize your pod so that if any money comes back, if you charge people to download, you will get your money. And some of these folks have been at it for a number of years. I love the names. Buzzsprout is great. Transistor is a nice nod to the past, to that history that I began by talking about. And then you can sign on with a listing platform to help get your podcast out to the people. Spotify, SoundCloud, iTunes, the ubiquitous Apple, of course, has to have a part of this business. And iHeartRadio, I like that one too, just for the name alone. And they will help get your podcast out there so that people who are looking for something in the subject area or just looking for something new might give it a try. Whatever audience you start out with, maybe it's predetermined to some degree by the specificity of your subject. But if, for example, you were going to do a podcast on forests and forest management and the problems with wildfires and so forth, you might very well be able to find a pre-made audience through the National U.S. Forest Service, through people who are interested in natural resources, such as the National Resources Defense Fund. There are many folks who care about the forests, and you can promote through them. If they find your podcast useful, they can share it, and their membership and number of interested followers is probably substantial enough to really get you up and running. That's just a random chosen example. I haven't surveyed the field to see how many podcasts about forestry and forest management are already up and running, but I would guess there are quite a few. The question then becomes, can you make a good one also? Or can you make a better one that people might prefer to whatever they're listening to now, or at least add to their feed? Just deciding you want another podcast doesn't mean you have to sacrifice any of the podcasts you have now. It's not like changing the channel. They can listen to one and then listen to the other. So then you promote on social media. And this is the easiest way. Facebook and Twitter are, in a sense, free. It takes a lot of work, but you can work it. And you can push it on Facebook and Twitter, and then promote your Facebook page and your Twitter on your podcast. Now you can also shell out some more money and pay for promotion. There are websites that will promote your podcast for you. Just like anybody would advertise their new restaurant or whatever new service they were going to provide. And then you can use email and paid email lists like MailChimp to network, perhaps with an existing audience and then perhaps with the audience that you generate on your own. And let me just say, however much money this might involve, it may very well cost you more than it makes you. But that isn't necessarily the only reward. In fact, I would say it's usually not the only reward. And as I was mentioning earlier, everybody who podcasts for NPR is doing it for NPR. It's part of their job, or it's a salaried position. So there is enough satisfaction in this. There's enough professional or amateur or avocational satisfaction in this to be its own justification. I like to think that we are in a new golden age of audio. Certainly the 30s, 40s were a golden age, when people got their news of World War II via the radio, when people got their entertainment, the big bands via the radio, and even into the 40s and 50s, the high point of a whole musical generation. That was largely an audio phenomenon, and television came along and piggybacked on it and to some degree took it all over. Now, because of audio's popularity and its extraordinary versatility in terms of how you access it, and of course because of the internet, podcasting is really giving us a new golden age of audio for all kinds of music, for all kinds of political commentary, for all kinds of help for people, whether that has a spiritual basis or whether it has a practical basis or an exercise basis. There's almost nothing you can talk about that people are interested in that doesn't make a podcast or make for a lot of podcasts. And that's why I call it the new golden age of audio rather than radio. And I do believe that it is a wonderful, vibrant part of what we can enjoy about our highly technological future. Certainly one of the parts that I find most gratifying to contemplate. So with that, I am glad to handle any questions that anyone might have about any of this. I hope I've addressed with this brief discussion some of the things that would matter to you most in trying to start a podcast. And I believe that these slides would be available to you after today, so you can check into those websites and anything else on the slides that went by too fast for you to write down at the time. So Charles, are you still with us, or shall I just take questions on my own?
I'm still here, and if you want to take questions, everyone can, if you have a question, you can either wave your hand, you can use one of the reactions, you can take your audio off and ask it that way. And Ron, if you're able to see everybody through the gallery view, yes, you can call on those. You can also post questions in the chat if you'd like, and we'll be monitoring that as well. Okay, great.
If you don't have your screen on, I think you can just hit the little blue hand, and I think that still shows even without your screen, doesn't it? So I can see if anyone has a question. Judy Greenberg.
Hi, Ron. Thank you so much. This was so informative, and I took lots of notes, so I appreciate this. Um, I'm just in the sort of thinking about it phase, and I wanted to ask you, getting back to, I guess, the names of the podcasts. Do you think a podcast should describe in the title of it that it needs to describe exactly what you're doing, such as like, how to bake a cake or
Right.
whatever you choose, or can it be more like, is there a success ratio based on the name of what the podcast is?
It's a wonderful question. I don't have a precise ratio, but I can say this: if you're going to make a podcast about making a cake, you might want to call it "How to Make a Cake," or you might want to call it "If I'd Known You Were Coming."
Okay.
Okay, because
Yes. Yes.
someone might look at that and it might
Mm-hmm.
mind Ida baked the cake. You
Mm-hmm. Good example. Right.
hopefully, and if it didn't, maybe what it triggers in their mind is curiosity as to what that podcast might be about. So you would possibly call it "How to Bake a Cake," and if you're a famous cake baker, for example,
Yeah.
you would probably want to call it "Baking Cakes with Judy Greenberg."
Right.
Baking
Right.
cakes with the Georgetown Cupcake Factory, or whatever they call it.
Right. Right.
There are places that have a strong reputation for cake. And if you are one of those places, or you can hook up with them, and they might very well like the promotion. So if you
Mm.
hook up with them and have a productive relationship about who's doing what for whom, and work out whatever money might be involved, both in the front end, this is going to cost you money, and in the back end, maybe we could make some money. And I can see why a cake maker might see that as beneficial, especially now that more and more things that we always thought of as on-site are remote, right? I mean, people are ordering things remote that one would never have contemplated
Right.
getting
Right.
anyway other than in a store. So,
Right.
and then the other thing, the place to start is go to one of these podcast aggregators and just type in cake. I suspect
Could could you describe what a podcast aggregator is again?
Yeah, in the slides, and Charles, I think these slides should be available. You should get the links to things like just how to get your podcasts, for example. I mean, most people have on their phone by now a download app that you can just type in the name of a podcast you heard of, and it'll download as many episodes as you want in a matter of seconds, minutes.
Right.
So whatever you're using, whatever browser you're using,
Got it. Got it.
type in podcasts, and it's going to give you various applications where you can find it. But I did put a couple of links in there for specific ones you might want to use.
Thank you. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yes, Kim.
Hi. So this might be, maybe it's an ignorant question. I don't know. I work at the University of Miami right now, and I'm in the Division of Development and Alumni Relations. So we've been doing a ton of virtual connecting with our constituents. And one of our stakeholders, or kind of cheerleaders of our university, has been hosting a lot of our webinars and has an interest in launching a podcast with us. And so we're working through the content and asking a lot of the questions that you've raised. But one thing we haven't really dove into is, how do we get our podcast on easily accessible platforms? I know I love Apple because it automatically downloads. It's a common app. Spotify is another common one. Do those have costs associated? Where's the best place to start with getting it out there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there are costs associated. They're not doing that out of love, but what they're doing it for, of course, is everybody wants to get eyeballs on the internet and ears on the internet. So they figure that if you go to them rather than one of the others, right, then you're more likely to be a Spotify user or an Apple user and so forth. And if you use a lot of streaming services, you know that it does add up to some money, and those folks are making some money, and they will be eager to carry, if you will, but they're going to charge you money for it. And you really just have to go just type in, how do I get my podcast on Spotify? And believe me, in seconds you will have the answer.
Okay. Are there any other kind of like, I guess I'll call it grassroots platforms we can start on that you know of that may be more cost efficient for while we're getting our footing?
Well, I did list a few in there that are not as well known. Obviously, if you want to have the maximum number of people see it, you would go to one of the most used streaming services. But there are a number of others, and I listed some of those names there on one of those slides.
Thank you.
And Ron, there are.
By the way, if anyone has any trouble getting back to those slides, if they aren't easily downloaded from this Zoom session, just send me an email, elving@american.edu, ELVING. That's all it takes, and I will shoot you the slides, today.
And there are a couple questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you're able to.
There we go. I see
One
them.
from Hope and one from Caroline.
Okay, Caroline asks, do you have any thoughts about interviews with academics, specifically in the humanities, and translating their ideas for a podcast audience? NPR and much of the journalism that I've done in my life has involved interviewing academics. And I wouldn't call it a special challenge. I would just say that it's different from man on the street or newsmaker or talking to politicians. I like all the ways that it's different, by the way. And it means that you can be much more specific in the questions that you ask, but then you also have to telescope back out and say, well, all right, how do I interest more people in the specificity and the depth of what you know? So if you're talking to somebody about Jane Austen, for example, and you want to talk about what Jane Austen meant to her time and why she has persisted as a meaningful interpreter of a woman's experience. Why do people still talk about Jane Austen? And you would ask those questions in a certain way of someone who has devoted their lives to teaching Jane Austen. And then you would try to draw them out and say, well, has that changed? You see people reacting differently to the same material today than when you started teaching? And then I would guess their answer to that might well be yes. I think people, have a different reaction to 19th century literature now than they did 40 years ago. But they would also have had a different reaction to it 140 years ago. So how much could the professor talk about that? And as an interviewer for a podcast or for anything else, it's perfectly fine to pursue your own interest, your own sense of what would I find interesting from this professor. That's fine. But also bear in mind, I'm 60-40, 50-50, 70-30, whichever works for you, that someone other than you might have different questions. So we regularly ask each other, what would you like to know if we got so-and-so on the phone, right? If we could get, if we could do an interview with the latest winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, what would you like to ask her? Now, you might have your own list of, you might be a big Glick fan and you might have been reading her for, decades. And you might have your own list of questions about her very specific poems that she wrote in the 90s or the 80s. And on the other hand, you might ask somebody that you work next to or live with, what would you like to ask her? And they might have a surprising number of questions. And, she's a very famous poet, but very famous poet does not mean very famous. So that would be something that I would want to talk to her about. Here you are you've won every prize there is, Pulitzer, National Book Award, you've won everything. Now you've won the Nobel. There's really nothing left. Tell me the truth. Does it make a difference to you? How do you feel? Does it make you feel different? And would you trade any of these extraordinary rarefied honors for, just a little more popular recognition? Come on, just a little more. I mean, you don't have to be you know, like a television star or a movie star. You don't want to sacrifice your privacy. Many writers don't want to sacrifice it at all. But, you know, wouldn't you kind of like to have somebody know, you know, who you are when you sign a check, something like that? I know maybe that's too, well, that's what I would do. And I would always ask somebody, what would you ask X person before doing an interview with someone? I do think with podcasting, you have this luxury. You don't have to say to a scholar who has spent her life studying something, I'd like to do an interview with you, and then we're going to put it on the air for 3.5 minutes. Because 3.5 minutes on NPR means you listen to the host ask the question for approximately 1.5 to 2 minutes of those 3.5 minutes, and you will now have 90 seconds to sum up your life's work. I know many people have had that frustrating experience, and that's with somebody who cares enough to ask them and put them on the air. With podcasts, you presume interest to some degree. You presume that these are people tuning into a Jane Austen podcast because they are interested in Jane Austen. Or maybe they're being flogged into doing it by a professor, but even then, that is a form of interest. That is a form of interest, even if it's somewhat coerced. And so you can let people answer the question, and then if you must, and if it's kind of podcast that is done with, you know, editing software and so on, you'll edit it. You'll take it down a little bit. But on the other hand, there are also podcasts that aren't edited, where just about everything anyone says in the podcast gets out there on the podcast, right? They're filling 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe doing it every day. A lot of that's just going to go through. So that's an advantage that podcasting has over any other form of broadcast, or any form of broadcast, or any other form of news and cultural program. Okay. Were you able to address Carolyn's question? Let's see, was Carolyn's question the one I just did? No. Here's Carolyn. Do you have any thoughts about, yeah, that was Carolyn's question. So let's see. I should be scrolling in the other direction. For those of us who do not have a journalism or voice acting background, are there any suggestions or resources for gaining experience or learning? You know, it's a question. I don't have a ready answer for that, but I do believe, well, for example, I know there are vocal coaches. I know there are people, largely actors. The woman who voices all those credits you hear on NPR, if you listen to NPR, you hear one woman's voice. Her name is Jessica Hansen. She's an actress here an actor here in Washington, D.C. She's been in a number of, you know, things like Veep and so on. She's not had long continuing roles, but here and there, and been in and out of the Washington Theater. She does vocal training that is extraordinarily physical. It has lots to do with making the instrument of your body and your head sound as good as it can sound. And so a lot of it is very physical exercise. And then there are things, and I, you know, it's kind of embarrassing, but I do this because I spent most of my life in print. So I had to go through this thing where you learn how to breathe, where you try to get continuous breathing exercises and things of that nature. It's very physical. And my guess is that you can find a podcast about it. I would wager you could find a podcast about it, and I'm sure you can find training videos. This is something I wish I had a little, you know, I could just give you a link for it, but I'm very surprised if people like Jessica don't have training videos for people, you know, as a source of income. And I know she does, you know, take on private clients. There are others, I'm sure, who do that as well. You know, it isn't as though you need to have 40 lessons or something. It's the sort of thing where you can pick up a lot in 2 or 3 sessions of dedicated training with a professional. let's see here. And quick question. A lot of the training that student journalists receive is around writing for print. What are the biggest mistakes first-time audio journalists make that we should avoid? The main thing, and I've spent many years in print journalism before I came to NPR, I would have to say the main difference in the way you construct a story in print is you're always assuming that the story may get cut shorter than they originally told you it was going to be. And they traditionally, rigorously cut from the bottom. So you try to get as much of the important stuff of the story into the first few paragraphs as possible, including having the most important thing, whatever it is, in the first few words, in the first paragraph, even first sentence. And you also think in terms of there being maybe a headline sitting on top of it and maybe something else explanatory, so that you're walking the reader in kind of fast, right? You hit them with the headline, hit them with the picture, hit them with the first paragraph, and they should be able to, in some sense or another, walk away and know what that was all about and have the essence of it in a matter of seconds, like a minute, 2 minutes. If they have time to read it all the way down through 1,000 words, fabulous, but they're going to trim that story from the bottom. In broadcast, even in radio, I like to think of it, and the way I talk to people making the transition is to say, make a movie. Make a movie. Think of this as not a seduction of the listener, not as a bam, 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 here's your information. You want to bring people in. You want to show them the story. Show them the story. Since you don't have visuals of the eye, you give them visuals of the mind. You describe, you play audio, and you create a mood and a picture in their mind. Old joke in radio is that the pictures in radio are better than the pictures on television because the pictures are in your imagination. So you're picturing somebody saying these things, and the picture that you conjure up in your own mind is probably more vivid and better to relate to than you would have if you actually could see the person as on television. So I think of it as get the pieces of tape that are going to tell the story, and then let the pieces of tape tell the story. And what if you only had the tape and you didn't have any narration or script or voice of reporter in between? What if you had to tell the story by playing 5 pieces of tape? Short, obviously 10, 20 seconds, maybe one a little longer. What if you had to tell the whole story and get the essence of it across without saying any words of your own? And put the pieces of tape in that sequence so as to have a kind of beginning, a middle, and an end, and then say, what am I lacking here? Maybe have the essence of it. I have the most important thing. We hear this leader, that leader talking, and what needs to be explained? What of their language needs to be translated? What do I need to do to make this more meaningful to someone who comes into it with a minimum of previous knowledge? And then add that, and that's your script. And if you start with the tape and you have some good tape, you can fill in the parts in between pretty quickly, and you fill out your time pretty quickly. And that was certainly helpful to me. When I say make a movie, I mean, think of the scenes that each one of your little bites of tape create as scenes in a movie. And then just stitch them together. Alrighty, let's see. Did I get a question from, okay. Has anyone put anything in the chat that I haven't read?
That looks like all of the questions from the chat. If anybody else has questions.
Thank you, Charles. I'm glad I'm not missing. Anyone else? Well, in that case, then, I thank you all very much for being here today and being part of this. And if you do have any questions, or if you can't access the slides through Zoom, then just shoot me a message, elving@american.edu, and I'll send you the slide deck. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. Have a good Columbus Day, or whatever we're calling it now.